Welcome, everyone. So lovely to have you here. My name is Anjula Gogia. I'm the events coordinator from Another Story Bookshop in Toronto. And on behalf of the bookstore and Biblioasis, we'd like to welcome you to the launch of On Property, the brilliant new book by local scholar, well, local if you live in Toronto, Rinaldo Walcott. So if you don't know already, Another Story Bookshop is one of Toronto's oldest independent bookstores, with a focus on social justice, equity, and diversity. Before we begin the evening, I would like to offer our land acknowledgement. The sacred land on which we operate has been a site of human activity for 15,000 years. This land is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Mississaugas of the Credit River, and the nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Turo Wampum says we are going to live on this land together and respect each other's sovereignty. The Dish with One Spoon is an agreement that recognizes that we live off the same resources. It is hard to eat a collective meal together off a dish with one spoon. Hence, protocols are put in place to ensure mutual respect and accountability to each other and to the land. Ontario is covered by 46 treaties and other agreements. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is still the home to Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. Our intersecting communities are comprised of those native to this land, Indigenous people from other territories, as well as settlers who have come here by choice, force, or otherwise a result of colonialism and imperialism. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission 94 Calls to Actions reaffirms that the treaties with Indigenous peoples must be lawfully honored. We are all treaty peoples and are responsible for honoring and upholding those agreements. We are grateful for the opportunity to work on this territory and to share space with all of you. So we're going to get to the launch in a few moments, but just a few housekeeping things and introductions. First of all, a big thank you to Biblioasis, the wonderful publishers who have put this little pamphlet together, this little but very powerful pamphlet together. Michaela Stevens, who is doing all the back-end tech and everything else, thank you to her, and to small presses across Canada who really are the cornerstone of brilliant publishing and critical publishing right now. On Property is in stock at Another Story Bookshop. We are open for curbside pickup, local delivery, and shipment across Canada. You can order online at anotherstory.ca. We've got a fully functional website. And if you're not in Toronto, or if you're in the US or the UK, please order from your local independent bookshop. We really need to support our indies across the nation and in other territories. So in the US or UK, you can check it out by looking up bookshop.org. You can also contact Biblioasis directly. Rinaldo has been personalizing copies of On Property. So in lieu of a live book launch, if you want him to write a little note to you, sign your name, say hello, write that in the notes for your web store order with anotherstory.ca. Just let us know who you would like the book personalized to. It doesn't have to be to you. It could be to anyone that you'd like. And we will get it to you one way or the other. So tonight you're in for a real treat. Oh, also I wanted to mention that Biblioasis is doing a live book draw. So during the event, to enter the giveaway for a free copy of On Property, all you need to do is type in a question in the comment section of the Facebook event or YouTube stream. And we're checking all the two different live Facebook events or the YouTube stream. And when we get to the questions at the end during the Q&A, we'll take a look at everyone and there will be a draw. Let us know where you're tuning in from. Are you in Toronto? Are you in the US, UK? Tell us where you're from. We'd love to hear where you're watching from. And also, if you're having problems with the audio, just type in a remark as well and we'll fix that. Biblioasis will be picking the winner from the list of questions, and then they will put the winner's name on the screen at the end of the Q&A with information about how to contact them for your free copy. Tonight, you're going to have a conversation with Rinaldo and also with our friends Beverly, Bain, and Idil Abdillahi. So I'd like to read everyone's bios, and then we're going to bring Rinaldo to talk about his book. Rinaldo Walcott is a professor in the Women and Gender Studies Institute at the University of Toronto. His research is in the area of Black diaspora cultural studies, gender, and sexuality. He is the author of Black Like Who, Queer Returns, and Black Life on Property. And we are very excited to announce that his long-awaited book, Long Emancipation, Moving Towards Black Freedom, will be published this April by Duke University Press. We have lots of copies of Long Emancipation on order at Another Story, so you can pre-order there. And, you know, like everyone else, we're very sad that this event is on a screen and not live, because most of you who know me and know Rinaldo know that we go way back, and we would have had a huge party for him, which we cannot do. But I have promised Rinaldo that when it is safe to, Another Story is going to host a big, big party for him. And there's going to be lots of food, there's going to be lots of drinks, and there's going to be a lot of people. So stay tuned for that, because these will not be the last times we celebrate these books. We need to do it in person, and we need to make community with each other. So that's my promise to you all out there. So stay tuned for that whenever that's going to happen. So joining Rinaldo is Beverly Bain, who is a Black, queer, radical feminist, anti-capitalist scholar, activist who teaches in the Women and Gender Studies Department of Historical Studies at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. She currently teaches and researches in the area of Black, queer, feminist, radical tradition, Blackness, gender and policing in Canada, and Black and Caribbean diasporic sexualities. Beverly has been an activist in the Toronto community for the past 40 years around police violence against Black and LGBTQ people. She is currently working on a series of essays on Black radical feminist queer activism in Toronto from the 1980s to the present. Idil Abdillahi is an assistant professor in the School of Disability Studies at Ryerson University. A critical interdisciplinary scholar, Idil has published on a wide array of topics such as mental health, poverty, HIV/AIDS, organizational development, and several other key policy areas at the intersection of Black life and state interruption. Idil and Rinaldo co-published Black Life, right here, Post-BLM and the Struggle for Freedom in 2019 with ARP Books. She is currently working on her forthcoming book, Blackened Madness, Medicalization and Black Everyday Life in Canada, which will also be published by ARP. We can't wait for that. So I'm going to check out now and welcome Rinaldo Walcott to your book launch.
Thank you, Andrew, for that lovely introduction and the promise of the party. I will hold on to that and look forward to it. Yes, we go way back. So thank you very much. And thank you to Another Story Bookshop, who is a champion of writers and thinkers and the community in a range of wonderful and amazing ways. I want to thank Dan Wells and Michaela Stevens and all of Biblioasis for producing this book with me on property. I'm really proud of what we have been able to do since Dan reached out to me, asking me to expand on a comment that I made on the current while speaking to Matt Galloway about abolishing property. Dan was able to push me to find a different kind of voice in the making of this argument. And what I want to say about the book tonight is going to speak to some of that. I'm really thankful that my friends, colleagues in struggle, and fellow thinkers could join me, Beverly Bain and Idil Abdillahi. These are folks that I have discussed all kinds of ideas with, and folks who continue to teach me that sometimes the idea has to meet practice. And no two other people exemplify ideas hitting practice the way that I think Bev Bain and Idil Abdillahi does it. So I hope you all have your little rum drink. I'm having a rum Manhattan with brandy cherries. And I thought we'd have a rum drink because, you know, Barbados figures in this small book in many ways that I didn't imagine it would figure. And of course, we know that rum comes from that violent and brutal encounter of stolen African flesh, white colonization, indigenous genocide and air genocide in the Americas. But Barbados particularly, the rum that I'm drinking is Mount Gay, established in 1703, and is rumored to be the oldest established rum brand in the world. So this Barbados figuring so much in this book as a kind of underlying premise of how I come to ideas around not just abolition of the police, not just abolition of the criminal justice system, but abolition of property, as a part of what I would see as the unfinished business of the first abolitionist movement. But Barbados also figures heavily in the book in another way because, of course, the Barbados being one of the oldest and longest colonies of Britain, and one of the very first established colonies, is one of the places where the prototype for what eventually becomes policing first took place. And that prototype of gangs of white men being able to question and challenge the movement of any Black person eventually found its way to the Carolinas, which later became the USA. And in fact, there's a profound historical story that is only told in drips and drabs, that is yet to be fully told, about the white plantation owners who left Barbados and went to the Carolinas and became some of the earliest colonists there as well. But the other way that Barbados figures heavily in this pamphlet is the drawing on of Rastafarian philosophy. Rastafarians fascinated me as a child in Barbados. Their idea, their philosophy of freeing up things, of liberating things, liberating life, liberating resources, their sense of communal and collective possibility and care and living. And without having that language at that time, or using that language at that time, I've now come to see how many of the elements of Rastafarian philosophy are imbued with a spirit and a practice of what we today call abolition and abolitionist politics and abolitionist philosophy. The other thing about Barbados that really has shaped the ideas in this book is, as I said, that I believe contemporary abolitionist politics and philosophy is a part of the unfinished project of the first abolitionist movement. And as we all know, that first abolitionist movement was to end the trade in African flesh, the slave trade, and to end plantation slavery. And as a small child in Barbados, I would often have to go on Saturdays into the city with my mom, and often she would drop me off at the library. And at the library in Bridgetown, Barbados, I would borrow these books that were all about the slave trade, but most of them were about the white abolitionists, Wilberforce, Granville Sharp, and so on. But as I read about these men who were reputedly the men who fought for the abolition of the slave trade and slavery, one of the things that became really clear to me in reading their work was the idea of the pamphlet, and the way in which the pamphlet was used as a part of their persuasive propaganda, exercise, and politics against slavery. And I've always been fascinated with this idea of the pamphlet. So when Dan approached me about extending my comment into a pamphlet, he didn't know that he had actually touched something very near and dear to me. So I feel really happy and proud to be a part of this tradition of writing a pamphlet in relationship to an abolitionist movement and abolitionist politics and abolitionist philosophy. The other thing that I want to say that really is a part of the ideas that shape this book is that many years ago in the early 1990s, when I was a graduate student, I used to be the teaching assistant for two guys, a guy called Russell Chase, and another guy called Winston Smith. Winston Smith, who's a professor now at Seneca College. And we used to teach this course at York called Liberating Voices. It was a second-year course. And then when I had my first job at York, I continued to teach that course. And so we taught this course, and we taught people like John Edgar Wideman and Chester Himes and Ralph Ellison and William Andrews and Gail Jones and Toni Morrison and Shirley Ann Williams. But we taught them from this perspective that the USA was a prison, both metaphorical and actually. And the course was grounded in John Edgar Wideman's semi-autobiographical work, Brothers and Keepers. And so, you know, again, we were thinking about questions of abolition without using that kind of language, because that language was not the language that was being used at that particular time. And so in many ways, On Property is a crystallization of a set of ideas, a set of thinking, a set of encounters that I've been having for a really long time. And then there's the question of writing from Canada, writing from the ground on which I stand. And of course, people who know my work know that I've been writing about Black life in Canada for over 25 years now, and trying to make sure that Canada is understood as a part of a larger Black diaspora, a larger global Black formation. And again, in On Property, I give you hints of this. So while, you know, many of the examples are drawn from Canada, deliberately so, because I don't want Canada to imagine that it's outside of these debates and conversations, I turn to the UK, obviously to Barbados, I turn to France, and I even turn to Nigeria as a way to demonstrate what is at stake. And the last thing that I want to say about On Property before I turn to Bev and Idil to say some words about their work is, you know, On Property is about the project of Black on freedom, from emancipations to prisons to property, and Blackness as property, and Blackness as refusing being made property. But our property is also about how policing and prisons and protecting property has structured all of our social relations. On Property then is also about how property as not just a material resource, but a set of ideas on to write the entire enterprise of our social relations since colonization and transatlantic slavery. So in that sense, property is law and law is property. So the property, again, is not just material resources, it's a set of social relations as well. And when it's embedded in social relations, it's when we see the terribleness of the police, when we see the terribleness of the criminal punishment system and so on. So that's why On Property ultimately argues that abolishing property is at the root and the route to Black liberation and freedom. That we can't actually begin to adequately account for the possibility of Black liberation and freedom without also having a political program and agenda that intends to attend to the abolition of property. And I know for many people that's a provocative argument, and it can go in all kinds of ways. And of course, to get to that place, we have to work through the history of policing, that history of policing that begins in Little Barbados. And we have to work through the history of prisons, and we have to work through what liberation looks like. And I thought that it would be most amazing to discuss these questions with my colleagues and comrades, Beverly, Bain, and Idil Abdillahi, both of whom bridge ideas and practices of potential Black liberation in the kind of activist scholarly work that they do. So I would now like to invite both of them to come onto the screen and say a little bit about the work that they do and how On Property has either connected and resonated with them, or how it has left them wanting or needing more, or what kinds of questions they might have for me, and so on. We're going to have a conversation. Cheers, folks. So Bev, do you want to speak first about your work and where it resonates with on property and so on?
I want to first thank you, Rinaldo, for inviting me to this conversation. This is particularly a critical time. It's an urgent conversation for us to be having. I mean, in the last, particularly last year, of course, but even prior to that, the work around abolition, the work to end policing as it exists, policing, defunding, abolition of police, abolition of the carceral state, has been profound. We have been seeing this kind of collective work and action actually taking root. Particularly, we've seen it in the U.S. People like Mariam Kaba, Angela Davis, Gilmore, and so many other people who have been doing this work, and we've seen that it has been pushed. A surge has been pushed forward with this work, from last year. But I also want to kind of also say that what this work of yours has done for me has always also helped me to also make a kind of connection in terms of my route to this country. I mean, I came here in the mid-70s, but when I came to Canada, I was already aware of the context that I was living in globally as a Black woman, growing up in Trinidad and coming to my teen years at a time when the Black Power movement was ripe in the Caribbean. And specifically, the killing of Beverly Jones, the sister of, Althea Jones Coynt in Britain, and how I grew up knowing those two names and knowing the life of Beverly Jones, and how her killing literally really moved me. And it moved me because it showed me the way in which Black women's lives are the center, where Black women are the center of these projects in terms of liberation and revolution, but then their lives are also projected in a particular way, following their death or their murder, their killing, in ways that are very sexualized, that are very presented in such demeaning ways, that they no longer, the actual political and liberatory elements they brought to it get completely erased. And then coming to Canada and knowing fully well that the first place that I wanted to know quickly, and as soon as I got here, where I could find Black people. And my mother told me, go to Bathurst and Bloor. And I walked out of the subway, and there was Sharona Hall and a bunch of Black women and Black men giving out leaflets. Buddy Evans was just killed. And they were telling us to come to Christie Pitts. Right? And I remember how all of this, immediately, I became immersed in a political movement, something I was hungry for. I was always hungry for something collective. After 73, I wanted to see something different. I wanted change. I realized that our lives were in peril. I didn't have the language, of course, but I knew there was something wrong about the context and conditions under which we lived. And coming here and connecting with Black women, Black activists, Black feminist activists like Sharona, like Dion, like Makeda, and other activists here in Canada, immediately propelled me further into, also becoming a communist. Right? I wanted to be part of a movement that was global, international, but one that was revolutionary and was for liberation. I mean, that was the language. It was internationalist. So I'm going to stop there because I know we'll continue to talk. And I know if I would like to hear from, I would like to give it a room to speak. But thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bev, for your comments. Thank you, Rinaldo, for having me. I really appreciate that. It's really interesting, Bev, that you mentioned Buddy Evans, particularly as you think about sort of activism and coming to, and in preparation for today, and in sort of reading the beginning of On Property, and the idea of a pamphlet. I pulled this out.
Right?
Right?
Great.
And so I just for people who may not know, this is from the privilege of like cleaning elders' offices. Right. And this is when, long before the Black Action Defense Committee was called the Black Action Defense Committee, is actually from when it was called the Committee for Due Process. And so on this pamphlet is sort of activist education. And interestingly, one of the key things that it says here is the inquest is biased, and it takes people through that and sort of the condition of Black people within the city of Toronto. So I found that so interesting, because I didn't know that that's the example that you were going to pull. But I thought of this in terms of how I locate myself, and in terms of being here, and in terms of what it means to sort of think about the reverberations of what this work looks like throughout the history of the city, and the complexities of what that looks like across gender, across race, certainly across sexual orientation, and also then what that looks like over time, given that sort of much of my work is around looking at the inquest as an autopsy, looking at it from a perspective of really blackening it, and putting that in context and in conversation with what Rinaldo talks about in terms of On Property, and your positioning of it as a pamphlet within a broader kind of, historical tradition. But what has happened here in the city, and how has the city used a pamphlet both as action, as theory, as collection? Like, this pamphlet literally talks about where to go, what to do. It talks about organizing in churches, organizing in schools, organizing in these spaces. It has like a political kind of a breakdown. And then it talks about the significance and the struggle, particularly of people that are coming from the Caribbean and their relationship with the police at the time, and what that looks like in that time in the city of Toronto. And I think about that in the context of what that means today, in terms of, even as we think about, the work of Akua Benjamin, who wrote her dissertation in 2003 on the issue of Jamaicanization of crime, and to think about that now in terms of the work around the Somalianization of crime, and the way that looks. And I think about people like Hawa Mire, who does work around that, people like Huda Hassan, who do work around that. I know Udbi Ali, who also does work around the experience of Somali women as well, the work of Robin Maynard, who's also talked about that. And so when we think about the way these shifts work, I bring it back to On Property insofar as the work that it did for me is it put me in a place where I thought about, okay, well, and I know we'll talk about this later, so I'll pause it there, but in what ways does Blackness reinvent itself as reinvent itself ethnically as anew in ways that seek to divide and separate? And so On Property does this work of really talking about the ways that Blackness across all of its manifestations does this work of capturing, containing, concealing, and then what that looks like in practice, right? So certainly one of my entry points as we continue to talk about this will be about how that manifests in terms of what those shifts look like, in terms of this current moment, what it looks like in terms of Black folks who are missing within the conversation around addictions in the city and overdoses, what that means in terms of who's sleeping in the parks and who's in the prisons, right? So if we're going to talk about property and roots and routes, I want to talk a bit about the root and route that keeps Black people as property, particularly through, in my case, the mental health system and the criminal justice system. And I think that as I really thought about it, and Rinaldo, what you did really beautifully is by really beginning this book by talking about Rastafari and Babylon. And I think about our time in South Africa together, and what would happen when we'd be waking up every morning, you, Abdi, and I, and getting ready. and what would be blaring out of my room, and you'd be laughing, and you'd be saying, "She's a real Jamaican." And then the conversations we'd have as you like walked me through South Africa and taught me things I didn't know, and what all of those kind of histories meant meeting in this place when we're walking through Soweto and the shop owners are all Somalis, right? And you say to Abdi and I, you're letting them call you Somalian here, and you'd never do that in Toronto, right? And what's happening in terms of power, what's happening in terms of class here, Idil, like, right? So there's so much complication. And when I think about property there, you have a set of displaced people that in the context of South Africa, in the particular place where we were, these folks are the shop owners, right? And so there's just so much about property and place and people and connected and disconnected histories. And so I look forward to talking about that. Sorry, I took really long. I'm excited. I'm excited.
That's great. That's great, because I think, I mean, both of you just made me think of, the ways in which, as I was writing on property, the struggle in Nigeria against SARS, the special police force that later was revealed or trained by the UK, that were not just killing people, but robbing people, just a real kind of rogue force. And it made me think about all of the kinds of ways in which policing becomes this kind of global force launched against Black people, even by other Black people, And so I remember you made me think about that moment in Soweto when the young man was talking about, we were talking a little bit about the ethnic violence with one of the young men. And he said, but in our section here, we have tried to preempt that violence because, our sisters and brothers are now married to some of the Somalis. So Somalis are displaced, but in that moment in Soweto, they're also, in terms of property, as owning things. They're property owners, unlike the South Africans. And part of why I wanted to begin with Rastafarians was to point at two things. One is that, Rastafarian sense of what it meant to be liberated was written off by other Black people as madness, right? And so one of the most powerful images that I have as a child is, what we would call the mental workers coming to pick up a Rastafarian because he picked some mangoes off of somebody's tree, right? Literally. At the same time, you stack that up against the fact that, and I write about this in the book, that I also grew up as a child, not very far at that point in time in one neighborhood that we lived in, not very far from cane fields. And if we went as kids and we broke a couple stalks of that cane, the watchman will run us all the way back to the neighborhood. So that property is something that you can hold on to, but the social relations that it shapes are really so fundamental to Black life. And so, when we think about, the kind of work Bev invoked, Sharona Hall, when we think about the kind of work that somebody like Sharona Hall did in the city of Toronto, we begin to see how Black women, Black feminist politics have always had this kind of profound critique of what needed to be absolved, dissolved, and gotten rid of. And Sharona was clear in her articulations about those kinds of things. And so, of course, in On Property, I draw heavily on Black feminist work because there's no way that you can write about the notion of abolition without drawing heavily on Black feminist work. But I know that you guys are doing the work of abolition, both in your thinking and in your practice. Bev, you with No Pride in Policing and the work that you guys have been doing to push this city, and Idil, the work in particular that you do with prisoners, people who are currently incarcerated. And I'm wondering if both of you will say a little bit about what it means to do that kind of work at this moment.
Okay, before I go there, I just wanted to pick up on something, on a sort of a theme here. Because one of the things that your piece did for me, and I have to keep that for the front and center, is how it also employ us to actually start moving globally, right? In terms of this particular work around abolition, that it's critical that we start thinking, we start making those connections globally and start opening up those spaces globally. And it helped me to track some of the work that has gone before, right? I mean, one of the things I remember Sharona Hall speaking to in the video on Sisters in the Struggle is about policing in Jamaica and about the way in which along a particular road nearby where she lived, the only road that big trucks can pass, she used to wait. She used to know every time when the big truck would pass with prisoners. And they were all black, meaning in Jamaica, black, but really dark, right? Also from the very poor areas, and the kind of work that policing did. And that when she came to Canada, that how clear it was, how that connection in terms of ownership and property and the subordination, the ownership of black bodies extended globally. Like she saw that immediately as soon as she came here, because she was fighting the same fight and seeing that particular black people and black people in general, but particularly black people who were Jamaicans at the time, were the ones who were particularly, having to deal with violence, police violence, were dying and being killed by the police. And she was fighting the same fight around race, class, and gender. So in terms of, throughout the course of my years, starting, in the 70s, working through that particular part, of seeing the connection between the kind of work that Black women and other Black activists did in this city, was always about challenging the kind of the way in which Black bodies and Black women's bodies. I mean, let me go back to the Black Women's Collective, because your work is also doing a kind of mapping in a particular way, of not just today, but also it's helping to kind of see that there is something bigger here, a connection to which we can, expand. So I'm wanting to pull that in the conversation. And, and to talk about the fact that, throughout, the struggle, the years, that Black women, particularly when they struggled around domestic workers in this country, that was a critical fight. It was an important fight because it amplified and it evident the way in which Black women's body continue to be property within this, through the context in which they were here as non-documented, but yet, they were both here as undocumented, yet they performed a particular kind of labor that allow a certain kind of ownership of who they were by the state in a particular way that was violent. And the way in which Black women, like Black feminists in the Black Women Collective, fought that fight, not so much about, simply about Black women having better jobs, but also about the conditions and the way that Black women's bodies were being taken up within the system and structures of capital, right? And we can't talk about property and not talk about capital.
Exactly.
And so that capitalism shaped Black lives and continue to shape our Black lives as property. So when I started working with, the NPPC, or the No Pride in Police Coalition, a big part of the work that I wanted to center was on understanding Black lives and understanding the context of Black lives and policing and the carceral system, and that we cannot, under any circumstances, talk about reforms, about training, about any of that, because at this juncture, the only thing that is possible, if we can't talk about freedom if we don't talk about the end of policing and the end to, the carceral state. So a big part of my work in NPPC, and has been with NPPC, is insisting on an abolition ethic. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to stop for now. And
Idil.
How do I go after that? Jeez, Beverly. Okay, so if I may, if I can work through sort of on property as a case, if that can make sense, yeah. Okay, so when I read through the entire text, and I also think it's really important for me to invite people to read on property in conversation with the body of work that Rinaldo has written, because I think that when you do that, depending on who you are and where you are, it will reveal different kinds of things to you at different times. I had the privilege of having to, read on property as Rinaldo wrote it. And in those moments, it was, the dissertation got done because I was reading on property, really. But I think at different times, it let me sit with things differently. And so now that I've had a bit more time to read it as a complete text, and having time to sit with it in conversation with other texts, I thought, so Idil, you teach folks in disability studies and you teach folks in social work. So how can you make a text like on property make sense when there's so many ways of knowing, learning, and understanding that they may not be privy to, right? And how do I think about that, like epistemically? How do I think about that ontologically? And how do I think about that in the context of like pedagogy and engaging people through that idea? And so I thought about, well, if we think about the idea of property and Blackness sort of on its face, what we know without Rinaldo making the case or not, which he did on property, which is that we understand Black folks as property. So if we begin with the inception of the relationship between Black people and colonial relationships as property, then we understand that from its inception, this is how our relationships and relations are dictated. And those relationships and relations are dictated then obviously differently based on gender, based on citizenship, based on sexuality, based on ability, based on a whole host of narratives. And so it is also for that reason that it makes it possible that we're able to move and be in shipment in the ways that many feminists have talked about. Like you said, Dion Brand has talked about, Christina and Nor Bessie and, Jackie Alexander, and a whole bunch of people have talked about this idea, Joy James, so forth, about what it means for us to be in this place. And so I was able to think about these ideas as well, these feminist ideas, by thinking through on property in terms of the dictation of what property means in terms of shipment and movement with what else that I know, right? And how else I've come to understand that. Sorry, I'm hearing buzzings and all kinds of things. So I don't know if I'm boring or if the Twitter's popping, y'all.
No, but I'm hoping that you would say something about the work that you do with prisoners.
Yes. Okay, so with prisoners. So how did I get to property and prisoners? Okay, so really simply, right? So a really basic example, then I was like gonna get there and do like a whole thing, but I guess it's not a lecture. So once you get incarcerated, really basic, the first thing that they ask you to do is to be able to pay for your body bag. What more do I need to say about on property? And I was gonna get there by talking about how we're in shipment and movement, then we're police, then we're over police, then we're in the carceral system, et cetera, et cetera. We get incarcerated. Then I was also essentially gonna talk about the ways in which, even for the people who are doing research, Bev, to your point about the experiences of women are still adjunct to the conversation about like carceralities, prisons, criminalization, et cetera, right? And so in that context, even if we think about the complexity of property and the ways in which women's bodies are used, there's a reason why even to this day, the narratives of women are absented in policing. But when when many folks get to prison, particularly doing a longer term sentence, and they say to me, Idil, they're telling me that I have to pay for my body bag first. Well, how else can I begin to understand anything from beginning to end other than from a lens of property? So we ask you, after we've dealt with you as property and sort of brought you within the system, then we ask you to think about your term there, of which if we're thinking about this in the context of abolition, if we're thinking about this even for the reformists that are listening, right? What reform is happening when a system, once you're incarcerated, says the first debt that you owe is that if you die, you must be able to pay for the body bag in which we're going to put you in. So I may have taken really long to get there, but not sure that there's any other clear way to think through that. When we think about carceral spaces and how bodies move and over policing and who gets into this country, right? In all these ways, once we do have you in the system, once you are incarcerated, what are we reforming when the first thing we ask you to do, the first commitment we ask you to make in the federal system is to say, pay for your body bag?
Yeah. At the heart of the problem of property is a deathly, deadly bargain. I'm wondering if Andrew has questions for us from the chat or if we should keep going. I think I saw a question about territory.
Yeah, like it's from Nandita.
Yes, I'm back. You could go on all night long.
I can't see the questions though.
They're on the chat in our own private chat, but I'm going to ask a question from Nandita Sharma, and there's another one from Carol Boyce Davies, and a few more that I'd like to get to as well. But Nandita asks, Nandita, who is in Hawaii, Nandita Sharma asks, would you please discuss how territory is also a form of property? I'm thinking of how the Caribbean, the Mediterranean, the Aegean, the Channel have all become a sea of bones, a quote from Edward Chanticat, and how sovereignty over national territories achieved and still being demanded is killing people by denying freedom of mobility.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't fully explore that idea in the pamphlet, but I explore that idea a little bit in the book that's coming next, The Long Emancipation. But what I do point to in the pamphlet that pertains to how territory, public space, all of these things get turned into property. And when they get turned into property, they get turned into social relations. I talk a little bit about in the book about the redesign of public furniture. And I talk a little bit about the way in which public space like parks have been redesigned so that gay men can't cruise and have sex in them anymore. And so what we see is that property is this thing that moves from the colonization and theft of indigenous lands, the theft of African bodies as property into a question of wealth, into things like real estate, into things like the kind of personal things that we own, into, the desire that we must own a house and all of these kinds of things. So property is this really amorphous thing that's really fundamentally about, the ways in which post-Columbus, post-colonization, post-transatlantic practices have shaped how we relate to each other. What's standing between us is something called property. It's something called access to ownership. It's something called we own it and we get to mandate what plays out from that. And that's why I said that the law, property is the law and the law is property. Because so much of what we constitute as law is about how to govern relationships to property. And so I've been having these interesting conversations I had an interesting conversation with Val Napoleon about property that might air sometime. And we had a little bit of tension around how Val Napoleon used law. Val Napoleon is an indigenous scholar of law at UVic. And one of the things that I was trying to convey to Val was that the way in which what we consider even colonial law was written to make blackness an exception to it. And so when you begin there, you begin to understand why black people are always in trouble with the law. because the law was literally constructed to make blackness an exception to it. Can you go back to the other questions from Carol Boyce Davies?
Could I just, do you mind if I just say something to that? As I'm reading it, I'm thinking also, in terms of Nandita's piece on discussing territory, is also the way in which, that if we think about Puerto Rico and we think about Barbuda and we think about what it means to own property and land, but also that it means a disposal of the people who live there and the people who were most impacted. Like, let's take Barbuda, for instance, were Black workers. They lost their right to actually live a daily livability in Barbuda because of the way in which, Barbuda itself became that which is owned now by the elites, by white Western elites, right? Who now could buy the actual island, thereby dispossessing Black people of their right to a livability. And if they want to be part and parcel of it, they have to be owned. They have to become property of the property owner of the land, right? So I think and what's happening is that what we are seeing in the Caribbean too is the move by big companies like Sandals, which is actually not only eroding the ecology and attempting to erode the ecology of those particular places, but it's also forcing people to leave and pushing people out and pushing people towards death through movements which are unsafe, right? So that when they arrive elsewhere, they become those who become disposable bodies, either incarcerated at the borders, as we're seeing happening. So we see that kind of, the way that property itself, undergirded by capital and financialization, is also inscribing and reproducing, particularly Black bodies, as property even further, right? In that context, I just wanted to add that.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to move on to Carol Boyce Davies, who asks, during the Black Lives protests, the protection of property was also central, more central than the protection of people's lives. Was that one of the triggers for the work as well?
Yeah. I mean, the work was in part triggered by the very public murder of George Floyd, and the fact that people who were isolating in their homes, many of us were isolating in our homes, when some people watched that 8 to 11 minute video of a white police officer kneeing the life out of a Black man who was calling for his mother, and a Black man who was saying, "I can't breathe." And unfortunately, many of us had encountered previously another Black man, Eric Garner, saying, "I can't breathe." And, that that a man, a human being, a Black life form will lose their life for allegedly passing a fake $20 bill tells you everything about the nature of social relations and property that we are faced with as life continues to unfold on this planet. And it's saying that one of the things, I guess one of the ways that I just realized I should say something about Nandita's question too. So there's a moment in the book, Nandita, where I tried to make a case for a renewed notion of the commons. A renewed notion of the commons that is not just about the earth's material resources, but also a renewed notion of the commons that's also about all of the technological innovations and inventions that we have made. So that the commons is not just about land and territory and some primordial relationship to it, but that the commons becomes everything that the human experience has produced and that if we're actually going to be able to survive the impending climate catastrophe, and if we're going to figure out how to live better together, we're going to have to engage in conversations that are about a renewed notion of the commons.
Okay, we have a question here from Khalil Grant. A bit of a long question, so Michaela will post it.
Can I just add really quickly to Dr. Boyce Davies' question, if possible? Is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
okay.
Yes, of course.
So, Dr. Boyce Davies, in your work, and again, as I read on property, there's a particular quote where you write, Black women they're here, they're in North America, and they're everywhere. And again, in the context of really imagining the complexity of policing Black women and what that means in terms of how we both narrate our stories, how we position and see ourselves, I think that analysis is also what Rinaldo talks about in terms of this global idea of possession and property and ownership. And so I just also wanted to add that, because I think that is so important in the ways that we want to consistently pigeonhole and narrow and make simple the ideas and ways that we imagine Black women and the struggles around Black women, but also how we imagine the ideas about abolition and freedom and what that means in terms of like the generative ways in which we construct and consume both how Black women live, but then how we take up these ideas more generally. So I wanted to add that.
We are running out of time, and there are some very detailed questions that are coming up on the feed, and they're going to take another hour. But I'm actually going to ask Diana Barrero's question. Khalil has one. So just so everyone knows, we are going to record all of these comments and questions and pass them along to Rinaldo. And maybe there'll be, at some other point, a way to discuss some of these, because there's some very interesting questions here and we don't have the time to engage with them fully. But Diana Barrero asks, would you be able to say more about how notions of property shift and morphs with time and space, and to build on Cheryl Harris's work to understand how whiteness becomes property? In 2 minutes or less, Rinaldo. Yes.
So look, in this particular take on what I did, I didn't take up Cheryl Harris's work on whiteness as property, because that's not where my focus was. But what I was really interested in trying to do in this work is to bridge the gap between the first abolitionist movement, which was this profound movement, a movement that, historians like Breon Davis argue it gave us all of the things that we use in our activism today. It gave us the pamphlet. It gave us direct action. It gave us letter writing campaigns. It gave us stop work campaigns. It gave us the practices of rescuing people. All of the kinds of things that we think as contemporary protests happened in relationship to the first abolitionist movement. And what I wanted to do on property is not so much focus on whiteness and the way in which whiteness holds is the underpinnings of this entire thing. We know that. What I wanted to do in this short work is to kind of launch a grenade, if you will, into a set of conversations that reach into the philosophy of abolition, that would allow us to begin to talk about, but how do we achieve some of the things that we say we want? What kinds of conversations did we need to be having to get there? What are the kinds of things we need to think through to get to the place of beginning to build the kinds of foundations that means that, 200 years from now, 150 years from now, we're moving towards, or we've already built the kinds of institutions that would make what we call abolition possible. Of course, Cheryl Harris's work is important to that, but that wasn't the focus of my argument. Wasn't around. It was about what have Black people, Black feminists have been actually putting in place since the first abolitionist movement to make this thing possible. But another iteration would obviously have to much more explicitly take up whiteness. I mean, I take up whiteness a little bit when I turn to Stephanie Rogers' work around white women and their ownership of slaves and so on. But I'm not fundamentally interested in the expose on whiteness at this particular time. I'm much more interested in how are Black people thinking about what this means, and why are Black people so profoundly committed to a notion of abolition? Because that's the thing that May of 2020 showed us. All kinds of people were out on the street, but what really showed us is Black people's deep commitment to a notion of abolition, a motion of literally making this world and remaking it. And that scares a hell of a lot of people, and that's going to bring a lot of violence to our communities from people who are opposed to it.
Okay, I think Beverly or Idil, are there any more comments you'd like to say before we wrap up? No, because
I'm going to leave it to Beverly.
Nope. Okay, so I think we're going to wrap this up for the evening. Oh, Nandita Sharma is the winner of On Property. Nandita, we're going to send it all the way to you to Hawaii. And you know what? I bet I can get, we'll figure it out. We'll figure it out. Maybe Rinaldo can personalize it, but we'll sort that out on our end for you. So I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. Remember, this will be posted. There's a lot of thoughts here, and you'll want to return to this discussion. So you can do that by visiting Biblioasis or Another Story Bookshop's YouTube pages. The recording of tonight's event will be posted there. Big thank you to Beverly, Bain, and to Idil Abdillahi for joining us tonight for the event. Huge thank you to Biblioasis, stalwart publishers. Check out their series, check out their books, and of course, Another Story Bookshops. We've got lots of great books on sale. We're closed to the public, but curbside pickup, local delivery, shipment. Keep your independent bookstores alive across the country. We need our customers to shop with us. Long Emancipation. I don't even have a cover where I can show you, but Rinaldo, how did you get 2 books out in 1 year? Like, what the hell happened there? And
Good
how big is that party gonna be?
He's
How big is that party
all
gonna
day.
be?
These are the kind of people your mom told you not to be friends with in school. The person who always gets their work done, always gets an A, and is always having a good time.
It's called trying to keep yourself sane and having a generous editor and publisher in Dan Wells.
Yeah, and I want to say thank you to Rinaldo and to Idil for the conversation.
Thank you both.
This was such a really critical and important conversation that we had tonight. Thank you so much, and thank you for your work, Rinaldo. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I appreciate you guys too.
Thank you, Biblioasis. Thank you, Rinaldo, for your
Thank you all. Thank you, Andrew, and everyone else.
Thank you all for joining. Thanks to you all for buying the book. Buy the book. Buy the book. All right. Have a good night, everyone.
Good night.